I'd like to bring Deb up just to start. I want to thank all the committee members, Doug, Ian, Chelsea, anybody I've missed. I see some familiar faces. Welcome students from CUCA, right? Welcome everybody over here. I wanted to start by thanking Deb Fabris-Kuhn. She's truly a champion for autism, not only in April, but every day. And we're pleased to be honored to work with you, Deb. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. Okay, I'm really embarrassed now.
Here's our objectives in the first part. I'm going to provide a historical timeline of autism, something hopefully a little different and interesting for you. We're going to start over 100 years ago, and John has given me 12 minutes to do that, so that'll be a challenge. He will then come on and provide, I think, the foundational considerations when we think about what sensory awareness is, and he'll build on that in the second half. Just to start, when you say what is autism, I know we could all answer that probably with one word. It might be a challenge, it might be heartbreaking, it might be inspiring. As a professional for a long time with autism, this is how I became to understand. So we'll just start off with just a review of a definition. Autism is a developmental disorder or a disability. And the key point here is it's really starts very early in life. It probably onset within the first 3 years. That may not be diagnosed that early, and in fact it often isn't, but that's really where it starts. We do know we face difficulty with communication, people with autism, and I see several here tonight. This could be a challenge. We shouldn't always think of autism, and I'll say this right out of the gate, so to speak, that autism isn't always just a problem that has to be solved. I think we need to go beyond awareness and learn to accept the differences, and that's, I'm really starting to think that way. But we do know that social interactions and repetitive ritualistic behavior are characteristics of autism, particularly seen in young children. We really don't know what causes autism. There's still a lot of research going on. There isn't a specific biological marker. There isn't necessarily a blood test that we do know. I do know that in England last month they're starting to show some data on that, so we may be heading that way. We do see a lot of genetic issues with autism, and certainly there's environmental factors, and it may be a combination of the two of this. So that said, let's try to get through 130 years. So where did it come from? I wanted to go way back to the 1800s just to mention a pioneer. In what he did was he surveyed Massachusetts, and back then a lot of those people were no doubt shunned, they were ridiculed, they might have been told to move on to the next town. Samuel Howe tried to start the process of surveying that. Langdon Down, better known for the syndrome for which he's named, he also worked on categorizing retardation. And one of his categories of developmental retardation back in 1887, those descriptions would align pretty closely with autism today. The etymology, which is really the origin of words, where did autism come from? The first time it was used was by Eugene Buehler. He worked with adults with schizophrenia, and he coined both the word autism as well as schizophrenia. It really comes back from the Greek and Latin roots, which most words do, and if you combine self and of state, it would really be a state of self, and that's a predominant way of understanding it in the very early days. That's Hans Asperger. He was a pediatrician and professor, and in one of his early lectures, he used the word autism, and he went on in his postgraduate thesis and wrote about the four boys and some of the issues that he was seeing with them, that their language was typical on a linguistic level, but perhaps had some differences. And his thesis was not translated until 45 years later. We'll touch on that in a second. Perhaps the person we most think of with autism is Leo Kanner. He established the first child psychiatry clinic in Johns Hopkins Hospital and was tied in with the university. He's considered the father of child psychiatry. His early pivotal and iconic paper which is titled there, came out in 1943, and that documented case histories of 11 children. You'll see shortly that that did not diagnose the children. That wasn't until later, but these descriptions, this is really where it started from. I think he helped portray autism. I don't think he defined it. That's what he named it, early infantile autism. And what he saw with the children he worked with was this insistence on persistent sameness. And also, they were quite happy and didn't mind being alone a lot of the time. Still remember Leo Kanner because actually this was his quote in Time magazine, and I found it and I read it. It was in a little blurb. Children with autism, of some of the parents he worked with, he said were kept neatly in a refrigerator that didn't defrost by their withholding parents. The next few slides are going to be difficult. They're difficult for me, and I'd like to in some ways dedicate tonight to the whole generation of parents who were blamed for their children having autism. The whole theory is considered a psychodynamic theory, that there must be something in the interaction within the family that has caused autism. I find that ironic because a lot of these families talk about having other children who did not have the challenge of autism, and so how could that be if it was because a lack of parental warmth? But this was in the 1950s and 60s. This was really what was happening. This book was a bestseller by Bruno Bettenheim, and it really was the Bible at the time, believe it or not. Fortunately, we had parents and professionals who said, this isn't right. And one of them is this man. He wrote a series of articles. He was a psychologist. He also had a boy with autism. And he started to show that the roots must be in biology, not in psychology. He also went on to co-found the Autism Society of America, who did a lot of conferences around and was the first one in America. The first one in England, they beat us by 3 years, John. These parents founded what became the National Autistic Society. It's still in existence. There's 4 chapters in England. They started this in North London. An educator at the time established the first school. So good things were happening in England in the 60s, including the first prevalence study, the first time someone tried to figure out how often is it happening. And for it to be roughly 1 in 2,000, by the end of my time talking, you'll see that that number has changed dramatically through the years. Couple points on some things that led to changes too was a book. It's really a journalist and a photographer got together and published Christmas in Purgatory. And many may be familiar with Geraldo Rivera, who worked in New York at the time, who did an expose, and it became a small documentary on conditions at the large state school in Staten Island called Willowbrook. Moving on into the 70s, there's still a lot of conflation with childhood schizophrenia. Schizophrenia and autism were paired or thought of together for a very long time. But in the 70s, we started to see that it was different, and again, a biological disorder probably is what was happening. Lorna Wing published the first book that was geared toward parents. She, at the time, her daughter was 14. In the 80s, we started to see a lot of work being done with early intervention. Lovas, who was originally from Norway, worked in California and started the Young Autism Project and had sites throughout the country. And he basically, what he emphasized was intensity of therapy. He recommended 30 to 40 hours per week, and he recommended to start as early as possible, and he did do that. And one of the techniques of early intervention at the time, and still used, is discrete child training. And just a quick remark on his behavioral theory of autism. Basically, that is saying children with autism could learn as other children do, as long as some special arrangements might need to be made. In the 90s, what was important was finally the US government recognized autism as a special ed category. And what that did was freed up free public education for parents, for their children at the age of 3. That's an important concept that's still very prevalent. We also saw in the 90s the work of Lovaas and others built on and became known as early intensive behavioral intervention. There were a lot of programs written for children with autism. And a lot of it was based on, well, all of it was really based on applied behavioral research and applied behavior analysis, ABA as we know. What's important on this slide, I think, is that the Children's Health Act, what that did is helped fund research. And in the 2000s, a lot of research started to be published in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. If you look back, it's just scores of research and all basically validating the approach of using behavior analysis to help. And Autism Speaks is the largest advocacy group foundation in America. I wrote this quote because I experienced this in real time. Toward the end of the 2000s, what happened was public schools started to see this more as a financial crisis rather than a clinical one. Perhaps in 2000, they would be like, hey, we need help. They would look to outside consultants and agencies, maybe similar to what some of the folks we've been providing at the time. But by the end of that decade, they just had so many children, and the number of hours, the resources started to shrink. And I sat with educators at the time down in New Jersey, and they told me, I said, we only have this much, and we have this many children to serve, so we have to find a way to do it. And it was a really difficult time. A quick sequence, and then I'll let John come up. This is how autism is diagnosed. The American Psychiatric Association publishes what's called the DSM. The first 2 versions were really based back long ago on hospital census, but they were trying to start to group and understand what was happening. But the first time autism appeared in it was in 1980 in the DSM-3, and that was the diagnosis infantile autism, and it distinguished itself from childhood schizophrenia. DSM-3 was revised in 87. The diagnosis name was changed, it always is. But what happened with this was it was a checklist which really eased the way it was diagnosed for pediatricians and psychologists much easier. In 94, Aspergers Syndrome was added. A woman named Uta Frith, whose book I'll talk about a little bit at the end, she translated Asperger's thesis in 1991, and that took all that time for it to arrive. It was thought of in the professional world, but it was very few people knew. I mean, you'd have to have a German translation, and there's even grainy things on the internet. You can find it, but she wrote it and published it in a book. She's a British researcher who's one of the leading figures in autism. Pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. And when I first started working, I'm like, how can we say not otherwise specified? What they really mean is it doesn't fall, the children, the people that would fall with this diagnosis, Asperger's syndrome didn't seem to fit. Classic autism didn't seem to fit. They were kind of somewhere in between. I think more on the, higher functioning end of the cusp, if you think of that way. But it's by its very title, it's a difficult thing. It's a pervasive developmental disorder. After a couple years of survey and public comment, professional comment, for the first time in nearly 20 years, the DSM was completely overhauled. Significant for autism, because everything now falls under this ASD, the Autism Spectrum Disorder. It's an umbrella disorder. Everything now is included under it. Asperger's Syndrome is no longer official diagnosis. PDD-NOS is not. Others that I didn't list, like childhood disintegrative disorder, Rett disorder, everything is under there now. And it changed to a 2-factor criteria from a 3, but we see the same things within it. What's interesting to John and I is, what is this going to mean? Social pragmatic language disorder. It's a new diagnosis. 2013, we're barely where we're going to see this being arrived, but I think some people that would have been diagnosed with autism may fall into this, and it may be in the PDD-NOS area. One thing that's funny about the DSM-5 that you might not know is it used to be Roman numerals, and now it's going to be back to what's considered Hindu numerical. So you'll see in the future, it'll be like, think of it like software. It'll be like, if it's just a revision, it'll be 5.1, 5.2. If it's a major new edition, it'll be the DSM-6. Okay, just one more for me. When we do talk about rate of occurrence, this is where we're at right now. Officially, it's 1 in 68. That data is, believe it or not, now it's 10 years old. This would have been done for 8-year-olds across 11 states. Not that wide of a swath, if you know what I mean. But that's the official rate. Center for Disease Control. What I found, though, right around Thanksgiving, last fall, a survey was published it's right on the CDC website, and this survey was with younger children, and it was a wider range of participants, and the rate, and I know Deb will agree, this is unfortunately astounding rate. When you look back and think of 1 in 2,000, to think of 1 in 36 is quite a difference.
So Donald has provided us with a very brief yet detailed history of the diagnosis of autism and how it really came about into society and to be what we recognize the diagnosis of autism to be today. The sensory considerations that we think about are very different per individual, as the diagnosis is on a spectrum. And when we think of that diagnosis being on a spectrum, what it really means is that not every individual with autism is going to present in the same way. So there isn't almost a definite like picture book example of an individual with autism. Everybody's going to be slightly different. Before we move into those considerations, I want us to think about ourselves, because we're a good starting point. We all experience sensory issues with ourselves on a daily basis. And I think if we are able to use ourselves as almost a baseline, it can give us somewhere to work from when considering an individual with autism. And the quote at the bottom is nice, so keep that in your mind as we talk about the sensory considerations that we can make. So we're going to consider the features of autism and really think about going beyond the diagnosis. Really that it's not clinical issues, it's not within those 2 criteria that Donald talked about, but they're definitely features that individuals with autism may experience. So sleep disturbances could come from sensitivity to noise. Maybe it's within the room or an outside room. It could even be that there's no noise. The reason why somebody may use a white noise machine or really be calmed by the idea of some sort of background noise. Individuals with autism may also present with an intolerance to food and have narrow preferences. And again, this is not for every single individual who has a diagnosis of autism, but it's something to really think about. The intolerance to food may not just come from the autistic tendencies, but also from gastrointestinal issues, which can be things like acid reflux, GERD, chronic constipation, chronic diarrhea. So there's all those issues that the individual with autism is experiencing on a daily basis. And that really feeds into that idea of sensory sensitivity. And we're going to explore what that means. So our sensory input is the 5 basic senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch and feel. And then also vestibular and proprioception. So vestibular is based around your balance. The idea of being able to walk on uneven grounds, being able to change the surface that you're walking on from maybe a carpeted surface to a tiled floor. And then proprioception is the body's way of knowing where it is in space. And the feedback comes through the joints. So an example would be me looking forward and reaching back for the wall. I know the wall is there because I'm getting that feedback through the finger joints, through the wrist, through the elbow, through the shoulder. So that's my body's way of telling me where I am in space. Sensory modulation, I want us to consider for an individual with autism, is that they have difficulty with sensory modulation. They are not able to process the information that is coming into the body, and there is a neurological function, so it's a function within the brain. It's something that is ongoing, so we don't smell something, process it and move on. It's that we've got a constant sense of smell, we've got the constant hearing and seeing and feeling things that are around us. And that can be very, very difficult. Right now, as far as hearing is concerned, I can hear that projector. But for me, that's okay because I know it's that projector and I'm able to zone that out. For an individual with autism, that could sound like a tractor trailer going past the house. It could sound like an absolute racket when you're trying to focus on something. Another thing to consider is the clothes that we wear. How many people really like a good tag in their shirt? Who would prefer to buy a tagless shirt so that nothing's touching? Does anybody like tight clothes versus loose clothes? They are all sensory considerations that we make for ourselves, but may not consider for an individual with autism. So for that individual with autism, this lack of ability, this real problem with sensory modulation can impact that person in different ways. And there is a list, but I really wanted to touch on the highlighted bullet points there. The idea of it impacting emotion, affecting attention span. When we say behavior control, it's not from the aspect of us controlling the individual with autism, but really because of that lack of sensory modulation, their ability to control their own behavior can be inhibited. And that's really important when we think of sensory modulation for an individual with autism, is that we are a supporting role. We're not trying to control that person. We are trying to support and help them to make the decisions that they need to make for themselves in order to be able to modulate. And relationships. Relationships are important for all of us. If the individual with autism is not able to regulate themselves, to modulate themselves, then the sheer presence of other individuals could be really uncomfortable. And as a result, will be a barrier to any sort of relationship developing. So to be aware of that as well is very important. So what can we do as therapists, as students, as parents, as friends, as people that support individuals with autism? We need to develop our own sensory awareness. So the best thing that we can do is use observation. Watch the individuals with autism, see where they are comfortable, where they are uncomfortable. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but think about certain scenarios. During an activity such as this talk right now, is there anything that is catching your eye, that is distracting, that maybe an individual with autism would just not be able to ignore, and it would affect their ability to concentrate? We can really facilitate that by positioning or thinking about where the individual with autism may be in the room to help them. Times of day and transitions can be an area of problematic. So preparation for the start of a day, the transition to maybe getting on the school bus, the build up towards lunch. And very often in the centre across the street, we notice that there are transition periods that bring about a change in behaviour for an individual with autism because they know that that change is coming. Being aware of a particular place or a space or an environment in which the individual is comfortable or uncomfortable, and we can really support that situation and make suggestions and change things that can help them. Other individuals in the group is important, and we will come back to that later on. So the biggest question that we can really ask ourselves is why? Why is the individual with autism reacting in a certain way? It could be that in a particular environment or in a particular place they are very comfortable and their behaviour, their reaction is positive, and then there is a clear change and that behaviour becomes less positive and more about agitation. Before we move on, I want us to consider this statement at the bottom. And I didn't give him the credit that he deserves, but Donald actually came up with this statement, and I think it rings very true. As somebody that is looking to support and facilitate an individual with autism, becoming sensory aware is to manipulate and organise the environment to influence their behaviour. And that doesn't mean that we want to control their behaviour, but we want to influence it in a positive way so that the individual with autism gets the most that they can from a situation.